This is a case you've heard before, or at least you've heard of it. The Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway. The man who confessed to killing 48 women and hinted there were more. In fact, there were likely many more. But there was just one problem. He killed so many he couldn't remember them all. Some victims were never named. Some were never found. And some are just simply lost forever. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because their stories were buried inside of a fraudulent memory of a killer who saw them as disposable. He was finally caught in 2001, nearly 20 years after his first known murder. It made national headlines, CNN, Time Magazine, a courtroom full of families who never thought they'd hear the truth. But this episode isn't a greatest hits recap. We're not here to retell the same old documentary beats. Instead, I'm going to strip away the myths and show you the realities, the things people still get wrong about this case. Why Ridgway wasn't caught sooner, what law enforcement overlooked, and I'll reveal what gave him the perfect camouflage. The disguise that kept him hidden in plain sight while women kept disappearing. These are the details the headlines missed and the lessons we can't afford to forget. We're here to ask harder questions. Why did it take so long to catch him? What warnings were ignored? And how did public perception and media bias shape who we cared about and who we didn't? Because the truth is, this story isn't just about a killer. It's about failure. Failure at every level, from the task force to the press to the very systems designed to protect the most vulnerable. And here's what makes it worse. Gary Ridgway gave police a DNA sample in 1987, but that sample sat unprocessed for 14 years. Not because it was lost, but because the science wasn't ready and the urgency wasn't there. So it waited, and while it waited, women kept dying. He didn't outsmart the system. He existed beneath it, invisible only because the people in charge weren't looking closely enough. The nickname came from a stretch of the Green River in King County, Washington, just south of Seattle. In 1982, the first bodies were found in that river, and for years it became a dumping ground. The name stuck, and so did the fear. To understand, you have to picture the area back then. South King County was a mix of new suburbs and old farmland, industrial yards, and wooded ravines. Pacific Highway South, also called PHS, was lined with motels and truck stops, while just a mile away the river curved through quiet banks, shaded by cottonwoods. It wasn't wilderness, but it was isolated enough that bodies could lie hidden in the reeds or beneath pine needles, undisturbed, just minutes from the highway. Ridgway wasn't brilliant. He wasn't clever. He was ordinary, and that's why he got away with it. This is True Crime Cases You Haven't Heard, and today, overlooked in plain sight, the Green River Killer. This is not the story that broke the headlines, but the one that reveals a harder truth. Even now, in the United States, nearly 50% or more of all murders go unsolved. And for many families, justice never comes. And that's where our story begins. This episode is based entirely on official court records, law enforcement documents, in public statements and media reporting. No reenactments, no dramatizations, just the documented truth. While some language may be difficult to hear, I've avoided using gratuitous detail and focused on the record. Coming up, a shallow stretch of water, a summer morning, and a body tangled in its own jeans. The Green River begins to speak. She was just 15. Her body was found face down in the river, ankles tangled in her own jeans, strangled so violently that the tissue around her neck had separated from the muscle. The man who killed her stood at her grave. More than once, sometimes in daylight, sometimes at night, he went back, not because he cared, but because he liked it. He later said, "If they were already dead, they couldn't reject me." This man didn't kill once or twice. He murdered 48 women by his own confession. Maybe more, but that's not the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part is that he wasn't a shadowy figure hiding in the dark, and while detectives chased false leads, misread the evidence, and dismissed the victims, he was hunting. Up next, a winding river, rustling bank, and 2 teenage boys who found something floating just beneath the surface. July 15th, 1982. The Green River cuts through King County like a forgotten artery. It runs behind strip malls and warehouses, past overgrown trails and rusted guardrails, a place most commuters pass without a second glance. It's a slow river, shallow in places, shaded by cottonwoods and firs that lean over the banks like they're trying to hide something. And that morning, 2 teenage boys were playing near the banks, skipping rocks, exploring the current, and then one of them saw it. A shape caught in the reeds, pale, twisted, bobbing just below the surface. 15-year-old Wendy Caulfield had been strangled. She disappeared days earlier after getting a ride from a boyfriend. And now, her body was tangled in her own clothing and drifting toward a culvert. Within a week, the river gave up 3 more. Deborah Bonner, Marcy Chapman, Cynthia Hines. All were young and all were strangled. Their bodies found in or around the same stretch of water, dumped beneath brush, partially submerged, tangled in branches. One, Opal Mills, was found laid out on the bank, her socks still on, her arms crossed over her chest, as if someone had posed her. From the prosecution files, the water was shallow, but the canopy of trees above made visibility difficult. The area was accessible by foot, if you knew where to step. This river, the one that gave him his name, became the killer's first dumping ground. Gary Ridgway would eventually confess to 48 murders, but even that number isn't the whole truth. Ridgway told investigators he recalled killing as many as 54 in King County, reported the LA Times. Prosecutors said he may have started killing in the 1970s and continued until at least 1998. He hinted at dozens more, women whose names he never bothered to learn, bodies never recovered, families still waiting. When the bodies kept coming, so did the theories, but not the arrests. Next, the first cracks in the investigation. Inside King County Sheriff's Department, the case was already starting to slip. There was no dedicated homicide team, no centralized system to track missing women. Many reports were purged after 30 days, assumed to be runaways. Detectives chased the wrong men. They tapped phones, bought cars, and shadowed cab drivers. They spent months following false leads. And all the while, the real killer was still hunting. By the fall of 1983, the body count had reached 20, and still no arrest, and no real suspect. Only the same tired myth. She was a prostitute. She probably got into something bad. But the women weren't just working girls. They were mothers and daughters and students and teenagers just trying to get home. And here's what nobody likes to admit. Police had already interviewed Gary Ridgway. He took a polygraph, he passed, and they let him go. Ridgway had already killed scores of women by then, but he wasn't worried. In plea interviews years later, he recalled, quote, "I was just relaxed and took the polygraph. I didn't practice or anything, just relaxed. And answered the questions, and whatever it came out, it came out. They weren't precise, or I don't know what the deal was," unquote. To investigators, the machine said, truthful. To Ridgway, it was just another ordinary day. The polygraph was treated like a science back then, but it was a myth, and one Ridgway exploited. That test should have raised alarms, but Ridgway's ordinariness was his camouflage. Gary Ridgway was born in 1949. When he was 11, his family moved to King County, not far from the very place where years later, so many victims would be found. The geography of his childhood became the geography of his crimes. He could have been your neighbor. He lived in a modest rambler on a quiet street. He trimmed hedges, had a clean driveway, and a barbecue pit in the back. He worked at the Kenworth truck plant in Renton, painting semi-trucks by day. He packed his lunch, showed up on time, and won awards for perfect attendance. He had a son. He attended church. He barbecued with friends. His wife described him by saying their marriage was excellent. Friends thought he was a saint. Ordinary, forgettable, and that was his camouflage. He barely graduated from high school. Nobody would have called him clever, and yet he showed an almost instinctive awareness of forensic risk. He later admitted he used the same simple techniques for hunting, killing, and hiding bodies. When he thought he may have left tire tracks near a dump site, he replaced all 4 tires on his truck and then tossed the old ones in different rivers. He never spoke to anybody of what he was doing, not his friends, not to his wives. His second wife later recalled how he would often disappear, coming home late at night, sometimes dirty and wet with no explanation. In hindsight, she believed those absences were clues that the killing had already begun years before police suspected. When women asked him outright if he was the Green River Killer, Ridgway would smile, he'd laugh. He'd say he's too small, too soft-spoken to hurt anyone. And they believed him. He had a system. He called them dates. He'd approach women gently, show them a photo of his young son, offer them food, promise they'd be safe. And then after sex, he'd wrap an arm around their neck and squeeze. It was quick, it was efficient, and it was almost silent. He'd redress the body, load it into his truck, and drive them one at a time to one of his dump sites. Sometimes with his child's bike in the back, hidden beneath a blanket. And the next day, he went back to work and showed up on time. And while detectives wasted months on false suspects, Ridgway was refining his methods. Next, his dump sites, his deceptions, and the irony of another serial killer who understood him better than the task force ever would. By 1984, investigators had recovered more than 20 bodies. They were found along Highway 410, Peasley Canyon Road, the wooden lots off Star Lake Road. all south of Seattle. But there was still no clear strategy. Detectives were chasing ghosts while Ridgway was perfecting his routine. He picked secluded spots, old logging trails, dirt turnoffs, depressions beneath fir trees. Bodies were left wedged between logs or covered in pine needles. Sometimes two at a time, arms crossed, ankles submerged. He even planted cigarette butts and gum wrappers at scenes, though he never smoked nor chewed gum. It was theater. It was a way to confuse the investigation. People assumed a serial killer would be volatile, violent, and alone. That was the myth. The truth was that Ridgway didn't fit the profile at all. He was steady and employed and outwardly harmless. And that mismatch, that kept him invisible. And then came the irony. In 1984, while he was on death row in Florida, Ted Bundy was approached by investigators working the Green River case, and Bundy offered advice that proved disturbingly accurate. He told them, "Don't ask where the bodies are, ask where he's going back to." He predicted the killer was blue-collar, quiet, forgettable, that he would return to the dump sites, and that sex with a corpse was part of the pattern. Bundy was 100% right, and Ridgway was doing all of it. But the task force didn't act on Bundy's insight quickly enough, and the murders continued. Next, the case finally breaks open, not because Ridgway was caught in the act, but because science had finally caught up. It wasn't until 2001 that DNA finally cracked the case. New testing technology matched Ridgway to 3 of the early victims. When police knocked on his door, he opened it calmly. He didn't fight the arrest. He didn't ask why. He already knew. 2 years later, in 2003, Ridgway took a plea deal. He would avoid the death penalty by agreeing to confess to every murder he could remember. On November 5th, the courtroom was packed. Quietly weeping relatives filled the benches, reported the LA Times. Ridgway sat emotionless but alert through the 90-minute hearing. One by one, prosecutors read each name aloud. He responded the same way over and over. Just a monotone, guilty. 48 times. Some family members wept, some stared straight ahead, some left the courtroom shaking with rage, and some forgave him. "I forgive you. You can't hold me anymore. I'm through with you." But others, "If it were up to me, I would rather they put him to death today," said Deborah York, the aunt of victim Cynthia Hines. The plea deal spared Ridgway from execution, but it also gave investigators something they'd never had before: his voice, naming names. A chance to close more than 40 cold cases, and to bring at least some families answers they had waited decades to hear. But even with 48 guilty pleas, not every woman had a name. Some were still Jane Does, and some families were still waiting. Not every victim had a name. Some were listed only by case number. Some were never reported missing, and some were forgotten even by the man who killed them. He described, that was the one with the orange socks, or the tall one, or the one near Mountain View Cemetery. But even he couldn't remember them all. He said, "I've killed so many women, I have a hard time keeping them straight." Some of the women were already slipping through society's cracks before he found them. Shirley Sherrill was just 18, trying to start over and in transitional housing. She loved to sketch and once told friends she wanted to be a nurse. her body was found nearly 2 years later. Denise Bush was 22. She was remembered as quick with a laugh, the kind of young woman who hated conflict and trusted too easily. Her friends later recalled that she had left with a man in a green pickup, but by the time they remembered, years had passed. Angela Gerdner was only 16, shy and soft-spoken, but fiercely protective of her younger siblings. She had barely begun to test adulthood when she disappeared. For decades, she was only known as Jane Doe until DNA finally restored her name. Estes was helping prosecutors in a rape case when she vanished. Her name was never even entered into the missing person system. And Meehan was reported missing within 48 hours, but her name never reached the Green River Task Force. Ridgway once claimed the real number was 71, but only 49 victims have ever been confirmed, and the lost? They're just lost to history, or to the empty folds of a killer's memory. Next, the science that finally caught up, and the detective who refused to let go. Ridgway gave police a DNA sample in 1987. It sat untested for 14 years, not because it was lost, but because the science wasn't ready and the urgency wasn't there. For nearly 2 decades, that evidence waited, and while more women vanished, it sat there. But by 2001, many detectives had burned out. But Tom Jensen refused to let go. He pressed to have the old sample retested at the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. This time, the evidence spoke, and it spoke Ridgway's name. We like to think DNA solved the Green River case, but that's the myth. The truth is, DNA only worked after 14 wasted years, and years that Ridgway kept killing. That breakthrough gave prosecutors leverage. They knew he was guilty now, but what they didn't know was how many. Ridgway held the truth, and he was ready to trade it. Next, the deal with the devil, how Ridgway escaped execution, and what he gave up in return. After his 2001 arrest, Ridgway agreed to talk. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he would give investigators everything he could remember, everything that he knew, every victim, every location, and every detail that would come back to him. The interviews weren't dramatic. They were mundane. He drank Diet Coke, he ate fast food, he spoke in monotone. But the things he said? Quote, "I've killed so many women, I have a hard time keeping them straight. I picked prostitutes as my victims because I hate most prostitutes, and I didn't want to pay them for sex." Unquote. He remembered the weather. He remembered the sun, where it was, if it was setting. He remembered the shape of the dirt turnoff. But not the women. He drew maps. He marked trees. He directed detectives to remains no one else could have ever found. And still, the truth was slippery. In months of interviews, as part of his plea deal, Ridgway admitted he was a pathological liar. Detectives had to pull information from him in bits and pieces. It was difficult to pin him down to every murder. Even when the cruelty matched his pattern, he sometimes refused to admit it. And when asked why he wouldn't just claim killings that weren't his, Ridgway replied, "Why? If it isn't mine, well, because I have pride in what I do. I don't want to take that away from anybody else." Detectives later said this chilling response showed not just his evasion, but his warped sense of ownership. Even at his most cooperative, Ridgway was still performing. In return for his confessions, he was spared execution. Families would never see him put to death, but more than 40 cold cases were closed. Surely that's a grim bargain. One truth traded for dozens of lies. Next, life behind bars. The ordinary routine of a man who caused extraordinary pain, and the controversy that erupted when he was moved to America's most notorious supermax prison. In prison, Ridgway did what he always did best. He adapted, he followed rules, he kept quiet. He quoted the Bible, said he found peace, claimed he was a changed man. But the detectives who spent months with him in interview rooms, they saw something else. He could cry on command, said one. It wasn't grief, it was calculation. He talked in lists, in coordinates, in weather reports, but not names. Detective Tom Jensen remembered how Ridgway sometimes just stopped mid-sentence, as if he was bored. He was done talking. He was done remembering. This was a man who destroyed lives and then got bored telling you about it. In 2015, Ridgway was transferred to ADX Florence, the notorious Colorado Supermax. Officials said it was to reduce isolation and ensure safety of operations. Families were outraged. How could America's most prolific serial killer be given a less restrictive setting? The backlash was swift. He was returned to Washington State, back to Walla Walla, back to his routine. And that's the part that lingers. He got routine, he got stability, he got to forget. But his victims' families, they got silence, they had empty chairs, and the ache of knowing he chose not to remember their names. Ridgway got silence in prison, but silence had also been protecting him long before in the system itself. The Green River case wasn't just a failure of justice, it was a failure of culture. The victims were labeled as high risk or unworthy, untraceable. And once that label stuck, the urgency to find them collapsed. Shirley Sherrill, just 18, had been living in transitional housing trying to start over. Her body was found nearly 2 years after she disappeared. But in those 2 years, there was no active search. And Denise Bush, 22, had a misdemeanor record and friends who remembered she'd gone off with a man in a green pickup truck. But by that time, investigators asked years later, and that was far too late. Estes was working with the prosecutor's office in a rape case when she disappeared. Her name was never even entered into the missing person system. A 1987 Seattle Times investigation concluded the killer was most active when police were the least organized. But marginalized communities had seen it long before the papers did. The Seattle Gay News wrote in 1986, "A dead hooker's paperwork. A missing teen is just another runaway." The warnings were there. They were loud, but they were ignored. The truth is, law enforcement culture of the 1980s was not designed to protect women like these. Missing person units were fragmented, databases didn't connect across counties, and sex work was treated as evidence of choice rather than circumstance. A runaway file could be closed in 30 days, even if the girl never came home. That apathy created the perfect blind spot for the predator like Gary Ridgway. He knew these women weren't being searched for with any urgency. He knew their disappearance would not spark public outrage. And Ridgway counted on it. His hatred matched the system's indifference, and that's what made him lethal. Even today, sex workers, many of them trading sex just to survive, still face higher risks and lower response. Families of missing women, even today, still report being asked about drugs or sex work or whether their loved one just ran away before an investigation even begins. The Green River investigation is more than history. It's a warning of what happens when bias and bureaucracy silence the missing. Next, let's talk about record versus myth. What we thought we knew about the Green River Killer and the truths buried beneath it. You heard me promise at the start that we'd cut through the myths. Well, here's what people still get wrong about the Green River case and the truths buried beneath them. Myth number 1, DNA solved the case. Reality? DNA did link Ridgway, but only to just 3 murders. The rest only closed because of his confessions and his plea deal. Myth 2, he was unknown to police. The reality? He was interviewed in 1983, polygraphed in 1984, and released. And they had his DNA sample in 1987. And it sat untested for 14 years. Myth number 3, he stopped killing after 1984. The reality? Well, bodies appeared into the 1990s. Prosecutors suggested his crimes might stretch back into the late 1970s. The timeline was never as neat as headlines made it. Myth 4, these women were targeted because they were vulnerable. Reality? Ridgway chose them because he thought no one cared, because police dismissed them, and because society ignored them. The Seattle Gay News wrote it plainly. They said, until white girls started showing up dead in nice neighborhoods, the media coverage was a whisper, and then it became a roar. Myth number 5, he gave nothing in return. Reality was, as part of his plea, Ridgway led investigators to 4 victims who would otherwise have remained unfound. A grim trade, life for truth. But truth nonetheless. The myths let him hide. The record showed why he thrived. And the victims, too often, they got lost in between. Next, the silence zone. The courtroom goes quiet, and families finally get a chance to speak. Some forgive, some demand hellfire. All of them remind us who this story is truly about. The courtroom grew still as each name was read, and then the families spoke. Some held anger like iron, sharp and unbending. Others shook with decades of grief, and some forgave. One said, "You can't hold me anymore. I am through with you. I forgive you." Another said, "You are garbage. I hope someone in prison chokes you unconscious 48 times, and the 49th finishes the job." One daughter stood and said, "My mom wasn't a prostitute. She was a wife. She was a mother. And I've had to grow up defending her dignity." A father left a rose at the swing set where his daughter once played. A brother went to the Green River and sat alone crying because the place where his sister's body was found was now a park. The silence was deafening, but inside it, their voices carried farther than Ridgway's ever could. The silence raised questions. What had we really learned? Next, the lessons of the Green River case and why some failures may still haunt us even today. The Green River investigation changed law enforcement forever. It led to reforms in DNA evidence preservation, interagency cooperation, missing persons protocols, and how police departments treat sex workers when they disappear. And still, some things haven't changed. Victim blaming is alive. Runaways still fall through the cracks. And sex workers, many of them just trading sex just to survive, they still face higher risks and lower response. Today we look back on the Green River case and see failure. But it's not too late to extract meaning from that failure. Not if we remember every name, not if we refuse to look away again, and not if we ask better questions next time. Even now, new names surface. Like Lori Ann Respotnik. She was identified in 2023 through forensic genealogy, 40 years after she vanished. Or Angela Marie Gergner, identified in 2009 after decades only known as Jane Doe. Their lives remind us the story isn't over, and maybe it never will be. Prosecutors later described Gary Ridgway as a man who treated murder like a career. He even referred to it as his career. He had routines and schedules and even contingencies, as if killing was his second job. He didn't forget his victims because of faulty memory, although he forgot them because he didn't care. He killed without conscience or sympathy. And once it was over, the women ceased to exist in his mind. And unlike other killers, he felt no need to brag, no need to share, no desire to taunt police or chase headlines. His lack of taking credit was what detectives later called his emotional silo. A murdering psychopath hidden inside of the shell of a regular man, a father, a coworker, a neighbor. He could strangle a woman one night and show up at work the next morning with a clean shirt and a thermos of coffee. And while Ridgway might sound singular, he wasn't entirely unique. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, he was also a family man, a church president. John Wayne Gacy ran a contracting business and entertained neighbors at parties. Samuel Little, convicted of 60 murders and suspected of more than 90. Also preyed on marginalized women who society ignored. The ordinariness, the camouflage, it's a common trait. What made Ridgway different was scale and detachment. And unlike Bundy or Zodiac, he didn't crave recognition. He didn't play games with police. He killed for the sake of killing, and then kept his mouth shut. That silence is what allowed him to endure. Not cleverness, not brilliance, just emptiness. Next, let's talk about how you can help keep these stories alive and why voices like yours matter. If you found this episode powerful, please leave me a 5-star review. It helps more people discover the show and the stories that deserve to be heard. To download the original court documents, read the confession, or sign up for alerts when new episodes drop, visit truecrimeunheard.com. And if this episode moved you, share it with a friend, because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember. Gary Ridgway was ordinary. He was forgettable. And that's why he thrived. He wasn't clever. He wasn't brilliant. He was allowed to keep killing because the system dismissed the women he targeted and ignored the warnings all around them. That's the hardest truth of the Green River story. This case isn't just about who he was. It's about who they were. The daughters, the sisters, the mothers, and how many of their stories were left unfinished. And if we don't carry those names forward, if we let the myths take their place, then the silence wins. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, stay subscribed. Goodbye.